So before I jump into this, I want to admit first off that I am a huge Ben Shapiro fan. I tend to agree with a lot of what he says, but here I am making this video to point out exactly where Ben Shapiro is wrong, definitively. And it's hard to argue against Ben Shapiro. I mean, Ben Shapiro is a man who skipped 3rd grade and 9th grade. He's extremely intelligent, he's quick, he's well-spoken, he has facts that I don't have, but I'm coming at this particular situation because I see inequity in some of the argument Ben Shapiro poses, and it's mostly based on my reading of the book The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. So where is Ben Shapiro wrong? Ben Shapiro tends to deny the existence of systemic racism. He suggests that systemic racism is an amorphous term that cannot be defined in fact with examples and thus cannot be fought and may exist. Every time somebody suggests that there is systemic racism, Ben immediately says, give me an example. What is an example of systemic racism? But first off, I want to lay some groundwork. It's clear that African Americans were at a clear disadvantage during slavery and the day after slavery. And when they found out Juneteenth that slavery had ended, there was a clear disparagement between the privilege and luck of white people over minorities and former slaves such as blacks. So when did the racial inequity level out between races? Was it 1 week after slavery? No. Was it a year after slavery? Probably not. Jim Crow laws were in existence, and 90 years after slavery, Rosa Parks was, targeted for sitting in the front of the bus. So clearly there was racial inequity a century after slavery. So are we all equal and level now? No. When will it be equal? I'm not sure, but blacks are clearly at a disadvantage compared to white people. There's statistics to back this up. This is evidence of systemic racism. If you look at the trajectory, 90 years after the Civil War and the Emancipation, Rosa Parks was targeted for sitting in the front of the bus. That was 90 years after the end of the Civil War. Blacks were still persecuted. And here it is 65 years after the Rosa Parks incident. So given that trajectory, it doesn't necessarily mean that we've reached any sort of equality. And I want to dispel the myth of white privilege. I don't agree that there is white privilege. I think humans are uniquely at a disadvantage. I think everybody has their own difficulties. I don't think blacks should be seeking the same luxuries of whites. I think African Americans should be seeking excess of what white people are granted. I think we should all be seeking better lives. I think there is room with the advancement of technology for the 10 or 20-hour work week. I think there's room to reorganize the entire monetary system and provide food, clothing, and shelter for everybody on the planet. Technology is growing exponentially, and the only thing that's hindering equity across humanity globally is our own insufficiencies in creating policy that advantages all people globally, regardless of race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. Just like a cut needs time to heal, after slavery and Jim Crow, it takes time to alleviate the inequity in racial privileges. And programs like affirmative action, while sometimes seem frustrating on some level, are equitable in the sense that we need to compensate, just like a pendulum swings from one side to the other and back. If we want to reach a center, a balance, we need to swing in favor of African Americans. We need to give them advantages that they weren't entitled to, because our system is still insufficient to meet the needs of minorities. The median wealth of blacks in 2007 was 14% that of whites. That means for every $100 a white person had, a black person had $14. So there's an undeniable wealth gap. 96.1% of the wealthiest 1% of people on the face of the planet are white. So it's easier to say that 100% of the wealthiest people on the planet are white. 96.1%. So if you're saying that African Americans have 14% what white Americans or Caucasian Americans have, and 96.1% of the wealthiest 1% are Caucasian, I think that's evidence alone of systemic racism. I don't know what the cause of this gross difference in income and wealth acquisition is, but in itself, a disparity that big is evidence of some systemic racism. Clearly, there are policies or cultural values that are established that are allowing Caucasians, white Americans, the privilege of gaining vast amounts of wealth, whereas African Americans are at some unique disadvantage. Otherwise, are we to assume that African Americans are choosing to be impoverished and choosing to be incarcerated? I don't think they value poverty and incarceration. That would be ludicrous. African Americans aren't graduating high school because of systemic racism. I graduated high school because I didn't really have a choice. I hated school the whole time through it, and I have a master's degree. I wanted to drop out of high school. I really didn't have the opportunity. I was pressured, an unwavering amount of pressure to finish high school. I finished high school. I didn't want to enroll in college. A day after classes started at a community college, I started going. My parents enrolled me, so I just went begrudgingly. I ended up getting an associate's at the community college, went with a scholarship because I did well in community college to get a 4-year degree, which I got in behavioral science at Drew University. Hated my whole time there. And then most recently, I didn't want to get a job, so I took out school loans to get a master's degree in television, radio, and film. My educational success is basically me accidentally succeeding. It's privilege on some level. I don't believe in white privilege, but it is relative to minority status. It is a privilege I have. I tried as hard as possible not to succeed academically, and despite my best efforts, I have a master's degree and I did pretty well. Whenever people bring up systemic racism to Ben Shapiro, he says, what is the evidence for it? So let's define systemic racism. It's a belief that inherent racial differences should determine eligibility and achievement. 13.4% of the population is African American, but 60% of prison inmates are black. The likelihood of incarceration for white men is 1 in 17. For black men, it's 1 in 3. African American inmates make up 75% of the incarcerations for drug offenses, even though there's an equitable use of drugs between white people and African Americans. We spend 6 times as much on incarceration than we do on education, which is, that alone is probably one of the big reasons African Americans are dropping out of school, because of class sizes, because we're not funding schools. Ben, you were privileged enough to have parents who recognized your ingenuity, your brilliance, your intellectual quotient, and had you skipped past 3rd grade into 4th grade and skipping 9th grade, and I believe, I couldn't find the evidence, that you went to a private school. You were born advantaged. You're extremely intelligent. You were born with that. And I'm not charging you with that. It's not your fault. You were born that way. But you were advantaged enough to have 2 loving parents that look after you and made sure that you could achieve as much as you did achieve. You know, attending Harvard Law School at such a young age. You were lucky. And where you fall short, I see, is your empathy for other people. You have no idea what it's like to be underprivileged, to be just a number in the educational system, and to not be looked after with such diligence and care as you were. You have no empathy for these people. You say, why are black people killing each other in these rates, and why are they dropping out of high school? Because they didn't have the same life you had. You have no empathy. Ben, you have no idea what it's like to live without opportunity at a critical time in your life, the developmental years, because you were looked after extremely well. 40% of black families have a net worth of 0 or less than 0. Culture. Let's define culture. Equality in society about what is valued and regarded as excellent. You said it's not about race, it's about culture. So it's not about the color of your skin or your DNA, it's about what is valued. Are you suggesting that African Americans value incarceration, value poverty? It's not about culture, it's about racial disparity. If African Americans were dying of thirst at a rate 6 times that of white people, you wouldn't be looking for evidence for their disinterest in water. You would be looking to resolve the problem. And the problem is systemic. We don't need evidence for it. If black men are incarcerated at rates significantly higher than white people, it's evidence for systemic racism. It means that the criminal justice system is structured and founded in a way that is leaving African Americans at a unique disadvantage. It means the way African Americans are charged with crime in the criminal justice system is leading to either more frequent incarceration or longer durations in prison, which means a larger percentage of the African American community is behind bars than white people. You don't need to ask why. It means our laws are not valuing African American freedom. You said level of outrage is not directly proportional to the amount of justification for something.
The idea that we're supposed to correlate your level of outrage with a certain level of justification, in other words, the more outraged you are and the more angry you are, the more justified you must be, is absolute nonsense.
But when slavery was as recent as several generations ago, when Jim Crow was around during my father's life, and he's still alive today, the amount of outrage is totally justifiable. It is justifiable because African Americans are at a distinct disadvantage, and you're not acknowledging that. That's where you fall short. You are not acknowledging the systemic disadvantage African Americans face. The Fourth Amendment protects people from unreasonable search and seizure. If you watch the show Cops, every episode of Cops, it's half an hour, there's at least one situation in which a cop pulls somebody over, pulls them out of the car, they say, I'm going to check you for weapons, they find drugs, and these people, sometimes it's 3 strikes you're out, meaning extremely long prison sentences for small nonviolent offenses. And you say African Americans are incarcerated for violent offenses.
Explain to me why the number of black kids in prison, not for innocent reasons, not for walking down the street and getting pulled into a prison, is so high.
No, I mean a large proportion of African Americans who are incarcerated are for minor drug offenses. And it's because you're wondering what law it is that is being violated. Where are we going wrong? Police are violating the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable search and seizure. You should not be allowed to pull people over, stop people for walking in the street, and search their pockets. That is their own personal property. If you suspect somebody of having a weapon that is concealed, then leave, like I do. If I'm afraid somebody has a weapon, I leave. I don't go looking on their person for it and find drugs and then incarcerate them, alienating them from their family and sometimes disenfranchising them, limiting their ability to voice their opinion as to how this country is run by not allowing them to vote, disenfranchising them. You went to an Ivy League school. It wasn't until 1948 that Princeton allowed their first African American graduate. So level of outrage Is it justified? Yeah, here it is justified. African Americans are at a distinct disadvantage. You're looking for evidence of the disadvantage? How about the 100-to-1 crack cocaine policy in this country that was around due to the war on drugs? That meant a gram of crack cocaine was equivalent to 100 grams of powder cocaine, and it turns out that crack cocaine is a staple of African American drug use much more than it is Caucasian American drug use. Caucasian Americans were typically using cocaine in powder form. Why is crack cocaine sentencing 100 times higher? 100 times, making life sentences for small amounts of crack cocaine, incarcerating black people. There's people serving sentences now, their whole life is destroyed. I watched a documentary about a bunch of young black African American people who had no opportunity to them, so they banded together and started selling small amounts of drugs, and they lived in a house, and the cops bugged the house, and they were all, at the end of the documentary, sentenced to a life sentence in prison for selling drugs. Well, there's tons of white people who are out there selling drugs who don't end up with the same sentences because there's 100 times more severe a penalty for selling the type of drugs that is culturally African American and not Caucasian. African Americans being sentenced at 6 times the rate of white Americans is systemic racism. It means our legal system has created a structure in which we are incarcerating black people. We don't need to look for whether or not black people are committing more crime. It means that the laws are geared towards making it such that African American behavior is against the law. Look, almost universally people use drugs. There are very select small group of people who don't enjoy either drinking. I mean, at one time it was illegal to drink in this country, or smoke marijuana where it's being legalized in certain places. Drug use is prevalent across the board. But if people are being incarcerated for drug possession, and it turns out that African Americans are getting life sentences for drug possession, you don't need evidence for racism. It means the legal system is set up such that it is illegal to act in a way that supports black culture. It means that we have set up laws that disadvantage African Americans. It is systemic racism in and of itself. You don't need any more explanations. You don't ask if Ethiopians have made decisions that put them at a disadvantage if they're starving to death. It's you resolve the issue. And the fact of the matter is that African Americans have less educational success. They have less opportunity for garnering wealth, and they have like a vast amount of higher rates of incarceration. And you don't need to ask why this is the case. You just look to resolve the issue, because it should be equitable among all people. All men are created equal is what we are founded on. And the fact is, if we're not meeting this expectation, you don't need evidence of anything else. If there's a disparity this big between African Americans and whites, you don't need any more of an explanation. We look to resolve this issue. 96.1% of the top 1% of wealth shouldn't be held by one racial group. It should be distributed relatively equally. We don't need any more explanations. We don't need to look for the root of this. We need to resolve the issue.